Greetings, ladies and gentlemen. I am Альберт Кіпа, president of the Ukrainian Academy of Arts and Sciences in New York, an association of scholars of Ukrainian and Eastern European studies, also known by its acronym based upon its Ukrainian language name as УВАН, that is Українська вільна академія наук. Today, I'd like to share with you some remarks about my recollections of my preoccupation with the times, life, and work of Леся Українка. But before doing so, a few introductory remarks, and in the end, a few conclusion statements. A curious thing about Ukrainian literature is that it travels badly. Ukrainian works of literature have not, as a rule, gained general currency beyond their linguistic frontier. To be sure, Ukraine's triumvirate of letters, Taras Shevchenko, Ivan Franko, and Леся Українка, have not been totally overlooked outside the Slavic realm, but Ukrainian literature has, from the very outset, been perceived in the West at best as a peripheral phenomenon. The 18th century scholar Herder extolled Ukrainian folk songs, yet saw them as achievements of a non-historical people. The Herderian distinction between historical and non-historical peoples was later given cruder expression in evaluative formulas like complete versus incomplete, that is, superior versus inferior nations. Criteria clearly not of literary scholarship, but of political propaganda. The West's perception of Ukraine as a marginal province of European culture resulted more from Ukraine's lack of political independence and autonomy and the resultant cultural isolation than from a confrontation with its intellectual and literary heritage. For the West has basically stubbornly refused to take seriously not only Ukraine's statehood, but also its language, literature, and culture. I shall not further attempt to gloss this difficult tangle here. Suffice it to say that literary relations obey no order of qualitative justice, but given the aftermath of the dissolution of the Soviet Empire, could Ukraine's literary hour in the West be finally at hand? It is long overdue. To be sure, progress has been made. But today I shall attempt to nudge it forward by looking at the reverse side of the coin of literary relations briefly discussed so far. Ranging from the past century to the present day, Ukraine's intellectuals, aware of their isolation, felt a nostalgia for what we regard as Western European culture and expressed the desire to adopt it and to be adopted by it. They were, of course, not alone in their aloneness, as we know, but they did manifest a predilection for German philosophy and literature, which, while not unique, played a seminal role in the development of Ukrainian thought and letters in general, and of individual literary talents in particular. Леся Українка, the poetess-dramatist, is a case in point. Born Ізидора Косач in 1871 in the Volhynia region of Ukraine, where she also spent much of her childhood before moving to Kiev, and to parents deeply interested in literature and the arts. Her mother was a noted author of the time. Леся Українка achieved a broad and classic education at home, as arranged by her mother through private tutors and self-tuition. She became well-versed in the major Western European languages and literatures, as well as in Greek, Latin, and other Slavic tongues, Russian, Polish, Bulgarian. I quote, "I want to learn all major European languages," Леся Українка wrote, in order to become acquainted with their respective literatures, end of quote. Moreover, she translated a great deal. It was her mother also who helped her select her pseudonym, linking her to her homeland. Lesia's intellectual development was also particularly influenced by her maternal uncle, the scholar, civic activist, and political thinker Mikhail Drahomanov. She acquired extensive knowledge of world history and drew upon that knowledge in the selection of her poetic and dramatic themes and subjects, which range from the Bible to ancient Greece and Rome, to early Christianity, to the Muslim past, to medieval times, to the French Revolution, to Spanish territory, and to the distant world of Egypt and even the 17th century America. Occasionally, Lesia Ukrainka also chose Ukrainian milieu, although the exotic settings provided her with surer camouflage from Tsarist censors. Her travels to Germany, Austro-Hungary, Italy, Egypt, the Caucasian and Carpathian mountains exposed her to new enriching experiences and provided intellectual inspiration, although they were undertaken in search of relief from painful tuberculosis of the bone with which she had been afflicted since childhood. Despite her illness and her relatively short life, she died in 1913 at the age of 42, Lesia Ukrainka left an impressive literary legacy. Several collections of poetry, 20 dramas, numerous literary essays and reviews, as well as a great number of translations from various languages. The legacy earned her recognition as a poetess, playwright, and as one of Ukraine's 3 most prominent authors. In a letter of 1894 to her older Ukrainian colleague Mikhailo Staritsky, Lesia Ukrainka expressed a firm conviction that Ukrainian literature would one day occupy, I quote, a place of honor among the literatures of other peoples, end of quote. Her works also clearly reflect her orientation towards Europe and beyond. The extent to which the poetess-playwright favored a universal literary horizon over a confining national or regional perspective is perhaps best illustrated in her defense of the writer Olga Kobylanska, who had been accused by Ukrainian critics of towing the German-Austro-Hungarian literary line in her works. Quote, "The Niemczina," meaning Germany, wrote Lesia Ukrainka, "did not destroy the talent of her colleague. Quite on the contrary, it saved her, exposing her to, quote, a broader European world, to new ideas, to a morphologically diversified diction, to world literature," end of quote. Among Slavic admirers and critics of German literature, Lesia Ukrainka was one of the most knowledgeable from the linguistic and literary perspective. She had mastered the German language and cultivated an appreciation of German literature early in her life. She eagerly read the works of Goethe and Schiller, extensively translated the poetry of Heinrich Heine, and attentively followed the career of the playwright Gerhard Hauptmann. Her critical essays and letters were generously spiced with German words, phrases, and expressions of literary and colloquial origin. To be a little bit more specific, let me just note that the 773 letters printed in the 12-volume edition of Lesia Ukrainka's collected works contain over 300 German words or phrases with direct citations from the German authors Hartmann von Auer, Bürger, Goethe, Schiller, Raimund Heine, Nietzsche, and Hauptmann, as well as from others. It was, however, the poetry of Heinrich Heine to which she turned in her formative years as a poet, and the dramatic works of Gerhard Hauptmann, in which she later sought inspiration and insight during her search for a mode of dramatic expression suitable to her poetic temperament, that had the greatest impact on her literary development. Lesia Ukrainka began writing poetry at an early age. She was 13 when her poems first appeared in print, and 14 when her first translations from Hohol, in collaboration with her brother, were published. In Kiev, Lesia joined the literary group Pleiada, which had as one of its ambitious goals the preparation of, I quote, a series of translation of the best works of European and Russian authors, end of quote, in order to make them more accessible for the Ukrainian reader. German authors recommended by Lesia Ukrainka for inclusion in the planned European Library series were Auerbach, Goethe, Heine, and Schiller. Endowed as she was with poetic talent, Lesia Ukrainka turned her attention to Heinrich Heine, ultimately rendering over 100 of his poems into Ukrainian. Most of the preoccupation with Heine, particularly the corpus of translations, fell into Lesia Ukrainka's first period of literary creativity, culminating roughly at the turn of the century. She was not the first to translate Heine, for his poetry had been popular in Ukraine for some time. This popularity was reflected in the fact that Lesia Ukrainka's somewhat older compatriot and friend, Ivan Franko, who encouraged the young poetess to translate Heine, was himself translating Heine's works. As a matter of fact, Franko assisted in the publication of Lesia Ukrainka's translations, and both their efforts appeared the same year. But Lesia Ukrainka was the first to attempt to reconcile the demands, to use André Lefebvre's terms, of translating both the text-oriented and reader-oriented perspectives. She saw herself, we would say today, in the George Steinerian mode as an interpreter of themes, attitudes, values, and of cultural contents. Not that she overwhelmed the originals, as sometimes happens with poet translators. She was, after all, still learning. But her poetic gifts provided her with an astonishing sensitivity towards the source text without depriving the translated version of her own distinct imprint. From the outset, Lesia Ukrainka's Heine translations illustrate her habit of subtly changing a work so as to make it her own. They also reveal something about both her taste in literature and the elements which most interested her. And in some poems, we recognize the embryo of her own later lyrics. In the collections On Wings of Song of 1892 and Thoughts and Dreams of 1899, Lesia Ukrainka's early collections of original poetry, we find reflections of her indebtedness to Heine's romanticism, lyricism, and musicality, his rhythms and tonality, his forms and themes, and much more. According to contemporary theory, the translation process involves the duality of spatial temporal segments, that is, a radical change in the linguistic cultural systems and of readers. Lesia Ukrainka seemed to have understood that intuitively. A cursory look at her rendition, or shall I say adaptation, of Heine's Die Schlesischen Weber, the Silesian Weavers, will illustrate the point. Lesia Ukrainka, in her translation, omits the adjective Schlesischen in her title Tkachi, the Weavers, and substitutes Kraina for Deutschland and Державі Старі for Altdeutschland. What happens? Well, thereby she shifts the concrete German perspective into a general, common, shared, or supranatural mode. The Ukrainian reader might be inclined to think of Russia, an inclination reinforced through the use of the word Tsar for the German König. If we recall the expressed goal of Lesia Ukrainka's translation work, which she shared with Ivan Franko, namely to make, quote, outstanding poetic achievements of Western literature available and comprehensible to the Ukrainian reader, and of quote, we will not be inclined to join in with those critics who were or are inclined to evoke the Italian proverb tradutori traditori. The impact of Lesi Ukrainka's Heine translation on her own development as a poetess has perhaps best been summed up by Yuri Boyko-Blokhin, a professor of Ukrainian literature at the University of Munich in the second half of the 20th century, where in a collection of essays entitled Gegen den Strom, Against the Stream, he wrote, "The very intensive interaction with Heine was only reflected to a small extent in L. Kosach's poetic physiognomy. In the translation, she knew how to faithfully reproduce Heine's word arabesques, his puns and comical rhymes, the ambiguous sentimentalism. But this we will not find in her own work. As L. Kosach went through Heine's poetic school, she emerged from it as a completely independent creator who had consciously overcome Heine's crisis-laden poetic world view." Lesia Ukrainka established her early literary reputation as a poetess and translator. But by the mid-1890s, she had embarked on a search for an appropriate dramatic mode of expression, and consequently carefully followed dramatic developments in Europe in general, and the work of Ibsen and Gerhard Hauptmann in particular. Scholars took note early of Lesia Ukrainka's interest in Hauptmann, and have acknowledged and addressed various aspects of the relationship. A comparative analysis of Lesia Ukrainka's dramaturgy with that of Gerhard Hauptmann shows that many of the problems dealt with in her plays are in one way or another related to questions raised in Hauptmann's works, although her solution in the eyes of some critics were at times contrasting totally with Hauptmann. But while I tend to agree with that position, I would say that the phrase "at times" should probably be replaced with "usually." And so in the words of the literary scholar Laszlo Kuciuk, I would say that as far as the conclusions in Lesia Ukrainka's plays are concerned, they often, if they have raise related questions to Hauptmann's works, Lesia Ukrainska's solution usually contrasts significantly with Hauptmann's. The history of Lesia Ukrainka's encounter with Hauptmann and his work can be broken down into three periods. The first, which encompasses the years of the middle to late 1890s, consists of an introduction to and a preliminary acquaintanceship with the German author's early dramatic endeavors. The second, covering the years 1899 to 1902 inclusively, represent an intensive involvement with the then extant dramas of Hauptmann and yield several key critical essays giving an all-encompassing assessment of Hauptmann's achievements and significance in the history of drama, including interpretations of individual works as well as two translations of Die Weber. The third, extending over the last decade of Lesia's life, can be characterized as a movement away from a general preoccupation with the works of the German dramatist and a focusing on an assimilation of the structural underpinnings, the intellectual and emotional ambiguities, as well as the dramatic possibilities suggested by the drama Die versunkene Glocke, The Sunken Bell, a drama by Gerhard Hauptmann. Lesia Ukrainka's interest in Hauptmann is also reflected in her correspondence. Although not replete with references to and quotations from Hauptmann's work, her letters do offer convincing evidence of her sustained interest in and admiration of the German author from 1897 on. Lesia Ukrainka's first drama, Blakitna Troyanda, The Azure Rose, suggests that the encounter began a year or two earlier and is reflected in the parallels between it and Hauptmann's drama for Sonnenaufgang, Before Sunrise, which, popular as it was at the time, may have served as a model or source for the structural and thematic development of Lesi Ukrainka's first drama. To what extent there was direct influence in this case, we may perhaps never know for sure, for Lesi Ukrainka, like Gerhard Hauptmann, was a voracious reader and a strikingly sensitive perceiver and recorder of the surface and subsurface literary and cultural currents of her time. On the other hand, the question of the relationship of Die versunkene Glocke to Lisova Pisnia is simpler. While scholarship has revealed parallelisms and contrasts in theme, plot, and characters, we have the poetess's own testimony. The inspiration came from Hauptmann's Märchendrama, fairy tale drama. It is, to be sure, not so much a question of simple influence, but rather one of general indebtedness. In the German dramatist's work, the Ukrainian writer found ideas and concepts that were, in time, to rouse her creativity. She recognized affinities to her spiritual makeup, adopted them, reshaped and enhanced them anew into a drama uniquely her own. Like the German author 20th century Thomas Mann, she possessed the capacity to select and transform to an unusual degree. This phenomenon can be demonstrated briefly if we look at Lesi Ukrainka's use of the theme of human loneliness, isolation, or alienation. Her protagonists, particularly Tirsa in Na ruinach, Neofit Rab in V katakombach, Dolores in Kamienny Hospodar, Richard Iron in Upushci, and Ante in Orgia, are also lonely in the Hauptmannian vein. They either do not have families or they are misunderstood by their families and or the society in which they function. But Hauptmann's lonely protagonists are rooted in the tradition of Western individualism and tend to seek their answers within themselves and alone. In contrast, Lesi Ukrainka's characters, although rejected by those around them, seek their fulfillment in the aspirations and concerns of their social environment, an attitude reflective of the Slavic poets' tradition of social and political engagement. As a critic, Lesi Ukrainka focused on Gerhard Hauptmann, the dramatist. She saw him as the exemplar of the uncommitted artist, faithful only to himself and his art. As such, he remained for her the dramatist innovator, a lonely figure of undisputed artistry and genius for drama, to whom she assigned a permanent place in the history of drama. Her perceptive assessment of Hauptmann's early work, especially Die Weber, Die versunkene Glocke, and Michael Kramer, demonstrated that she, although familiar with Western European critical reaction to Hauptmann, applied her own aesthetic and literary values, intertwining descriptive passages with evaluative statements, insightful interpretations, and erudite reflections. Thus, she could rightly call herself a Hauptmannistka, which she did in one of her letters. As a prelude to a conclusion of my talk, it is important to note that Lesi Ukrainka's attitude towards Heine and Hauptmann was, though not uncritical, always affirmative, always receptive to that challenge and inspiration that emanate from the work of artists so distinguished as the two Germans. As such, she played an influential and determining role in molding and enlarging the Ukrainian image of Heine and Hauptmann. She brought to her contemporaries a deeper appreciation of the true greatness of the German poet and the German dramatist, and to posterity an eloquent testament to their significance as influential literary voices of their time. Her admiration of and indebtedness to them in regard to the development of her own poetic and dramatic talent seems not only obvious, but also legitimate. In the final analysis, the significance of influence and affinity is perhaps best seen in the light of Goethe's comment to Eckermann, Goethe's secretary, and this is a rough English translation, quote, "I owe much to the Greeks and French. I am infinitely indebted to Shakespeare, Sterne, and Goldsmith, but in saying this, I do not show the sources of my culture. That would be an endless as well as unnecessary task." End of quote of the citation. In conclusion, let it be noted that Lesia Ukrainka, like Goethe, became knowledgeable in world literature and was familiar with its many forms. She recognized that her poetic talent sufficed to give new life to aspects of mankind's cultural heritage. However, the poetess' fertile imagination and fruitful creativity are only one part of her development. The second and no less important part is her desire to penetrate and enlighten life. In this sense, Lesia Ukrainka surpassed with her fairy tale drama Lisova Pisnya, the forest song, the form principles of the symbolic romantic drama, as well as the dramatic traditions of naturalism, and pointed to a new spirit of the times nowhere else to be seen at that time, and thereby earned for herself a distinctive place not only in Ukrainian but also in European literature. Her forest song, Lisova Pisnya, represents not only a yearning and striving for perfection, but the perfection of a pioneering achievement, comparable to what Goethe achieved in his drama Torquato Tasso. 20th century European drama could have begun with Lesia Ukrainka. Yet what she achieved in the dramatic realm remains, unfortunately, for the most part unknown and consequently unacknowledged in the West. Will the future bring acknowledgement? Contra spem spero. A postscriptum. To my right is the cover of УВАН's latest publication about Lesia Ukrainka, Tamara Skripka's Спогади про Лесю Українку, Volume 1, the title of which reflects our current virtual sesquicentennial theme series, and Volume 2 of which will appear shortly in print and can be pre-ordered by emailing УВАН at uvan@verizon.net. So join us in commemorating the sesquicentennial of Lesia Ukrainka's birth by ordering a copy of books, volumes 1 and 2 of Спогади про Лесю Українку. Thank you for listening.